New conversation about practical based in, and that is the entire concept of pshara. We kind of alluded to this already, that today we don't paskin already in the times of the Gemara, the Yerushalmi talks about this. We don't paskin din mamish. We paskin something called pshara kraiva l'din. And I like to use the word an imposed negotiated settlement. That's similar to what the din would be. So let's discuss this. Vavam and Beis in Sanhedrin, and the discussion starts from an interesting place. So Belezer ben Osha b'Yosef Glili, Reza son of Yosef Glili says, Osher l'vtzaya. Anybody who negotiates, it's osher to do that. Now Rashi right away tells you, Misha ba'u l'din osher l'dayanim l'tzah. Once they come to judgment, to a court case, then the dayanim are not allowed to make a negotiated settlement. In other words, obviously Rabbi Yossi is not saying that if you and I get into some sort of financial dispute, we can't settle it. No. Once you come to court, you can't settle it. Anybody who praises the botzei harei minaret is blaspheming. That if the botzei blesses, he desecrates God or degenerates God. But rather, the judgment should pierce the mountain. In other words, there's something proper about getting to the bottom of a matter. And a negotiated settlement precludes the ability to get to the bottom of the matter. So once you come to a judgment, now, mishpat leilokimu. What's right, what's wrong, who's right, who's wrong, that's a godly matter. Now, the Gemara goes into a little bit of a digression. V'chein Moshe Haya discusses the different attributes of Moshe and Aaron. Moshe was Yikov Asadin Sahar, and Aaron was Oev Shalom, Verodev Shalom. We're all familiar with that. He loved peace, he chased Umesim Shalom, and he created Shalom and Andach Veru Shenemar Torah's Emes Hayisa B'Fiyo. It says by Aaron, he had a Torah of truth in his mouth. Now, the Gemara then goes on to another interpretation of Botzei Berech Niyetz Hashem, which has nothing whatsoever to do with din, with Beis Din. It's just good to know. Botzei means, it could be to negotiate. That's what we're saying. If you bless the negotiator, then you blaspheme God. Botzei could also mean to cut, like B'tzias Hapas. So, Botzei could also mean to steal. So it can mean a couple things. And one other interpretation of this is Botzei Berech Niyetz Hashem. If a person steals something and then uses the item he stole to bless God, that is considered a blasphemy. So literally it means if you steal bread and then you make a bracha on it, so you think you're doing a great thing by making a bracha, it's really a ni'itzat Hashem. But obviously the idea is a person engages in practices that are not appropriate for a ben Torah, for a from Yid, and then he goes ahead and does some magnificent work of tzedakah, ni'etz Hashem. That's not a favorable thing. All right. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha argues where the Gray picks up again. Mitzvah l'vtzah. He says, no. On the contrary, it's a mitzvah to make a negotiation. Shenema emesu mishpat shalom shiftu b'sharechem. Truth, justice, and completion or peace you should judge. Now that's really a contradiction, because judgment by definition is not shalom. If two people have a financial conflict and one loses and one wins, and the guy who loses, he never thinks this shalom, right? So how does the pasuk say? This is a pasuk in Zechariah, emes, truth, and judgment, and shalom shiftu b'sharechem. It seems like a contradiction. Where there's shalom, there's no mishpat. Where there's mishpat, there's no shalom. You know what mishpat is shalom? When the judges create a negotiated settlement, or let's call it an imposed negotiated settlement. You're going through Beis Din, but you're negotiating, you're doing it in a way that both people feel they come out of Beis Din, they got a little something. Not one person won everything, the other guy lost everything. Oh, that's a bitzua shat shalom. And we say the same thing by David HaMelech, and David was oseh mishpat tzedakah. Well, when there's mishpat, there's no tzedakah. When there's tzedakah, there's no mishpat. Okay? Yeah. So what is mishpat that has tzedakah? That's bitzua. Okay, so we have two pshatim here. We have Rabbi says, and now we have Rabbi Shimon ben Karcha. No. Mitzvah l'tzoa. All right. Want to point out, the Gemara now asks, what's Rabbi Yosef going to do with this pasuk by David HaMelech, that he was doing mishpat tzedakah? So he says an interesting thing. He paskins, he learns the pasuk that David HaMelech first did mishpat. So he said, you're right, you're wrong. And now the losing party, Nebuch lost out on money, he would take, especially if it was a poor person, from his own pocket and pay the poor person for the money he lost because he judged in favor of the rich guy. Okay? It's an interesting pshat. Okay. Rabbi
They actually paid with party. That's the fellow case.
Well, no, but the point is it wasn't settled, right? It was a judgment. Okay? Yeah. Okay, that's really a side point. Now let's go down to the medium lines. The end of the medium line. Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe has another pshat. Two people come from you for judgment. Before the Dayanim hear their words, or even when you hear their words and you don't know how you're going to paskin, then it's mutter to say, go out and compromise. Once you hear the words and you know how the din is going to go, then you should just give the din, you shouldn't compromise. So this is kind of a third pshat, I would say. A third pshat. Yeah. Now, okay, so that's a third pshat of Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe, which has to do not when you hear the arguments, but you seem to know how it's going to paskin. Now you should not engage in any type of settlement, any type of negotiated settlement. Yeah. Okay. Now let's go to the bottom over here. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Says Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. I'm sorry. Hechi Dami Gmardin. I'm sorry. Let's go to the second line. V'hatamide de Rav Hava. Ki hava asul kamei de Rav Huna. When they came in front of Rav Huna for a judgment, Amar Laho ideina bisu ipshara bisu. They would ask them, do you want a din or do you want a pshara? That's what Rav Huna did. He would ask the people, what do you want? Do you want us to paskin a din Torah here, or do you want us to try to get a pshara? Okay? Now, Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha seems to say the same thing. You're supposed to ask them, ideina bisu ipshara bisu. Okay? What do you want? And the Gemara goes on and says the following thing. That Rabbi Shimon ben Karcha holds it's a mitzvah to ask them, what do you want? Tanakama holds you can ask them what you want. And Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe holds like this. Once you hear how the din is going, you're no longer allowed to ask them what you want. Okay, so we have a range of opinions here as to how you should approach the situation as to what you should do. We're going to learn the halacha in a minute. But before we learn the halacha, there's a fascinating Yad Rama on page 10. There's a fascinating Yad Rama on page 10. The pasuk says, Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, two psukim I should say. Pursue justice. And it also says, B'tzedek tishbar amisecha, with justice you should judge your colleague. So, what's very interesting is based on the Gemara, that one is talking about negotiated settlement and one is talking about actual justice. He says the following thing. But tzedek tishbar amisecha, with one time we use the word tzedek, we're talking about justice. Make sure you're honest, you're righteous in judgment. The judges aren't biased. When you talk about pshara, he uses the word tzedek twice. You'd think that an post-negotiated settlement should only use the word tzedek once. He says, no, that's not true. Why? Because look, when you're saying this guy's right, this guy's wrong, it's a little bit easier. You open up a Shulchan Aruch and you paskin. When you deal with pshara, what are you doing in pshara? You're looking at context a little bit. You're looking at the situation a little bit. And it takes more lack of bias, I should say, to come up with a pshara that's appropriate and fair than it is to come up with a judgment. In other words, if two people come in front of you, right, and you're biased towards one person, but you open up a Shulchan Aruch and it goes like the other person, chances are, if you have a modicum of sense of what it means to be a from person, you're going to pass what it says in Shulchan Aruch. But now when two people come before you and you're seeking to do pshara, it's harder to remove biases, and you mamish have to be ma'ayin, and you have to say who's really saying the truth. This guy's story, maybe it'll pass in Shulchan Aruch because I can't dispute it, but Lamaisa, something's funny about it. There's a lot of factors that go into pshara, and that's why the Torah says the word tzedek twice. It's interesting because we always think that pshara is simpler, but he's saying it's not so pasha. Now, what?
Makes sense.
How do we pass in Shulchan Aruch? So let's start this. We don't have all day today. We're going to continue. But let's see how we pass this in Shulchan Aruch. Mitzvah lomar levalei dinim b'tchila. It's a mitzvah to say to the balei dinim hadin atem rotzim o pshara. Do you want pshara or din? If they want a pshara, you do a pshara. So that's kind of the middle road. That was Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. That's how Rav Huna paskin. Okay? Mitzvah levtzoah. And we paskin mitzvah means it's a mitzvah to tell them, to ask them. Now, where the Machaber says, just like you have a hazara, a lot of warnings not to be biased, not to tell judgment. It's not like when there's a pshara, the dayan can do whatever he wants. Now, he kind of leans, according to the approach, it's always better to do pshara. So that's sort of like a b'shuma karcha. Ask them first, but like it's better to do pshara. Before you made a decision, even if you heard their words and you know where it's going, mitzvah of Torah. After the judgment has been decided, and you say you're chayav and you're zakai, then you can't go back and make a pshara. Okay?
What about the plaintiff? Is there a field that they're supposed to have for one or the other? In other words, if I was always telling you to do it, should I choose good or
No, it seems that we paskin not like a Bezer B'Rosh Rabbi Yosef Glili. It seems like we paskin a B'Shom Karcha mitzvah l'vtzoah. If there's a mitzvah for the dayan to ask, it's clearly that the best way to do it is pshara, because after all, the Torah says, "B'tzedek tishbar hamizecha." The Torah says, "Ki hamishpat le'elokim." Once we're saying already you should ask, then obviously we're saying Shalom Shiftu B'Sharechem. It's better to go after peace. And the preponderance of Hadam Auraim and Tanaim seem to wind up. We seem to be leaning towards pshara, notwithstanding the Lezer Rosh basically Mamish held you shouldn't do pshara. Okay. And in fact, the Sma discusses this. Once we say it's a mitzvah pshara, namely it's a mitzvah for the dayan to say, do you want a judgment or can we do a pshara, right? Pshara chadayan lahasbir. The Sma says on page 11, the dayan should explain, levalei dinim shebepshara noach lem. It's better with a pshara. Uledaber alibam, and to talk to them. Ula yaskimu ala pshara. It's not just, do you want din or pshara? The dayanim, according to the way he's interpreting what Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha intended, they should sit down and they should say, look, hetzachti chevre, please understand something. We got to do, it's better to do pshara. It'll come out happier for all of us. Let's do a pshara.
If somebody owes me money, I would want this, I want to pay that, right? The pshara would say, okay, split it half and half.
So we're going to discuss this. The pshara does not mean that if someone owes you $100,000, Beis says, I'm sorry, it's only $50,000. That's not pshara. That's not pshara. Pshara may mean someone owes you $100,000. You know, is it okay if he pays you today? Could you take 90? Or instead of he's obligated to pay you 100 by Rosh Hashanah time, let's extend it by a half a year. Pshara is not just willy-nilly canceling people's owings, and we're going to see that in a minute, okay? Now, the Mechaber Paskins, based on the Gemara Rishonim, that once you say Ish Ploni Ata Chayev, Ish Ploni Ata Zaka, you're no longer allowed to do a Pshara. Okay? Now you have it in. You rendered a judgment already. So the Shach says like this. He quotes the Shiltei Giborim, Vizel Shono, okay? Nira Be'ena, it seems, is on the top of page 12 on the right. She'ein kol dvarim ha'lalu amurim elak sha'dayanim rotz b'hatal pshara k'via nira be'neim shal bidas ba'alei dinim. This idea that after Gemar Din, the Dayanim can't do a pshara, that's when you talk about what I've been mentioning, an imposed negotiated settlement. Because that's it, they paskin the shaila, right? How does that look? The Dayanim power, no, we don't really mean what we paskin, they paskin. But let's say they go to the litigants and I say, look, Ruvain, you owe Shimon $100,000. But then they said to the Shimon and Reuven, they said, look, folks, why should you be fighting? Shimon's going to have to squeeze the money out of you. Let's be mochel 10,000 and I'll pay you the rest right away. Or let's figure this out. In that case, after Gemar Din, they could also be a pshara. This that we say that after Gemar Din doesn't mean the Dayanim should not try to somehow work things out between the parties. What it means is that Dayanim should not impose their own settlement ahead of time. After the Gemar Din, without the agreement of the two litigants. And he says, as a matter of fact, if after the Gemar Din, after you paskin, you get the two litigants to agree, that's a big mitzvah. Tzava shalom be'nadam l'chavero. That's a very big mitzvah. It's bringing peace be'nadam l'chavero. And that we should do. All right, let's stop here. It's hot. Shakoach for learning. Tomorrow we'll be back in nice air conditioning. We don't know how spoiled we are.